In the early years of the 15th century, most people still believed that the known world only included Europe, Asia, and Africa. That perception changed dramatically in the late 15th century, specifically in 1492, when the expedition led by Christopher Columbus, representing the Spanish crown, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and discovered new lands for Europeans. This was one of the most important events in human history, marking the first contact between two worlds that had developed separately since the dawn of humankind. Under orders from the King and Queen of Spain, on the 3rd of August, 1492, Columbus's fleet, consisting of 3 ships with about 90 men, departed from the port of Palos. After crossing the Atlantic, on the 12th of October, 1492, the expedition reached an island called Guanahani in the language of the local people. Columbus named the island San Salvador. Afterward, many settlers arrived on this island. According to some records, the local population at that time numbered about 250,000, primarily the Lucayan and Taino peoples. At that time, Columbus believed that the island of San Salvador was located on the eastern edge of Asia, and that he had reached the Indian subcontinent. In reality, it was an entirely new continent, what we now know as the Americas. Because of this misconception, when he encountered the indigenous people living there, he called them Indians. Over time, they came to be known as Native Americans or indigenous peoples. Based on archaeological and geological evidence, scientists suggest that humans first arrived in the Americas when groups migrated from northeastern Asia across the Beringia land bridge, which once connected Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. These groups gradually spread southward, eventually populating both North and South America around 14,000 years ago. The earliest inhabitants of the Americas are commonly referred to as Native Americans or indigenous peoples. Some sources estimate that at least 15 million Native Americans lived in the Americas before Europeans began migrating to the continent. In several regions, indigenous peoples had developed great civilizations, constructing impressive architectural works and establishing cities, states, and empires. When Columbus's expedition first reached parts of the Americas, it marked a historic event that had a profound impact, sparking the territorial ambitions of many European nations at the time. Evidence of this is clear. Immediately after Columbus's first voyage in 1492, a series of expeditions were launched by other European powers. Exploration spread along the Caribbean islands such as Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and gradually pushed into the mainland of the Americas. Spain soon came to dominate large portions of North America, as well as vast territories in Central and South America. In 1497, the English explorer John Cabot landed on the coast of North America. A year later, in 1498, Columbus's third expedition reached the coast of South America. Meanwhile, France actively sought territory in the northeast of North America and on various islands in the Caribbean and South America. Portugal, not Russia, also quickly explored and colonized Brazil, which remains one of the largest countries in South America today. As a result, almost the entire Western Hemisphere gradually fell under European control, leading to profound changes in the landscape, population, and ecosystems of these regions. Many historians argue that it was European colonization that brought centuries of death and devastation to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Warfare, famine, and epidemics introduced by Europeans killed millions of Native Americans. By the 16th century, diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles had already caused catastrophic population losses among indigenous communities. The wave of Spanish colonists flooding into Central America in the early 16th century was a tragedy for indigenous civilizations. According to many estimates, within less than a century, as much as 90% of the native population in Central America, most notably the Aztecs, was wiped out. Epidemics such as smallpox, influenza, typhus, and measles devastated what is now Mexico, beginning in 1519. Europeans, having long been exposed to these diseases, had developed partial immunity. Indigenous peoples, however, had no resistance, making the impact catastrophic. When Europeans began transporting enslaved people from West and Central Africa to South America, these same diseases also spread among African populations. By 1558, epidemics had swept across North America and reached as far south as the Rio de la Plata between modern Argentina and Uruguay, killing millions of indigenous people. By the early 17th century, global temperatures began to fall sharply, with cooling trends continuing into the 19th century. This climatic downturn is known as the Little Ice Age. Previously, many scientists believed that the Little Ice Age was caused entirely by natural factors, However, by combining archaeological evidence, historical records, and carbon data from Antarctica, researchers have pointed out that one of the main reasons the Little Ice Age became so severe was the mass death of millions of indigenous peoples in Central America at the hands of European colonizers. Vast areas of farmland were abandoned, allowing forests to regrow naturally. The reforested area is estimated to have been as large as modern-day France. As we know, the average temperature of the Earth's surface is determined by the balance between solar energy absorbed and heat released back into space. Normally, this heat escapes into space, but it can be trapped by greenhouse gases such as CO2 and water vapor in the atmosphere. Côte inch particular plays a crucial role in regulating the Earth's climate. When forests regrew on abandoned lands, large amounts of CO2 were absorbed, which helped stabilize the global climate. In the 17th century, this rapid reforestation in the Americas contributed to a measurable reduction in atmospheric CO2, lowering global temperatures. The decline in atmospheric CO2 was significant enough that global temperatures began to fall around 1610, more than a century after Columbus's expedition first reached the Americas in 1492. The reduction in CO2 during this period is estimated to have been equivalent to 2 years of today's global fossil fuel emissions from coal, oil, and natural gas. Until then, Colorado 2 levels in the atmosphere had remained relatively stable, making this one of the earliest major human-driven changes in the planet's carbon balance. On another level, experts believe that the natural resources and food brought back from the Americas and Africa helped fuel the growth of the European economy. This influx of resources allowed Europeans to rely less on subsistence farming at home and focus instead on developing other industries. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Western economies had become increasingly prosperous through trade and colonial expansion. Large numbers of ships continued to arrive in North America. The massive migration of Europeans to the continent during this period severely undermined the living space of indigenous peoples. In order to acquire land, settlers frequently expropriated indigenous territories and, in many cases, directly killed native communities. As European settlement expanded, indigenous peoples were gradually deprived of their lands and pushed deeper into the forests. Beyond direct violence, colonists also pursued destructive policies that further devastated native communities. Two of the most notorious were the extermination of bison, a critical food source for many tribes, and the system of scalp bounties, in which settlers were paid for killing indigenous people. Before European colonization, North America is estimated to have supported as many as 50 million bison. Colonists slaughtered these animals on a massive scale, both to undermine indigenous food supplies and to supply raw materials for European industries. Epidemics brought from Europe also weakened native populations, accelerating their dependence on dwindling resources. The result was widespread famine, with many indigenous communities facing starvation as their primary food source collapsed. By the 18th century, tens of millions of bison had been exterminated by European settlers. Even more horrific was the scalp bounty policy, under which colonial governments and settlers paid cash rewards for the scalps of indigenous men, women, and children. In 1703, for example, the Massachusetts Bay Colony authorized payments of $55 per native scalp, a sum equivalent to several $1,000s in today's terms. In the following years, the bounty for indigenous scalps continued to rise. By 1720, the payment had increased to $76 per scalp, which would be equivalent to roughly $5,500 in today's value. After the American Revolution, 1765-1783, the United States of America was established. Almost immediately, the U.S. government entered into a long chain of armed conflicts with Native American nations, conflicts that persisted well into the 19th and even early 20th centuries. During the 19th century, European powers also interfered in territorial disputes between tribes, exploiting divisions to seize more land and weaken indigenous resistance. By the 19th century, more than 50 million Europeans had emigrated to the United States. At the same time, the population of Native Americans continued to decline drastically, mainly for two reasons. First, the spread of infectious diseases brought by explorers and traders, and second, the relentless military campaigns and massacres that devastated indigenous communities. The second major factor was the series of European and later American military campaigns, which inflicted enormous destruction on native communities through repeated massacres and enslavement. From 1810 onward, the United States intensified its territorial expansion by seizing indigenous lands. In 1830, the U.S. government passed the Indian Removal Act, which mandated the forced expulsion of all Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River. This law is regarded as a clear example of systemic genocide, as it specifically targeted a group of peoples for removal and resulted in the deaths of thousands. Members of the largest tribes east of the Mississippi, such as the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, suffered devastating losses from disease, hunger, and exhaustion during the forced marches westward, known as the Trail of Tears. Smaller tribes in regions such as northern Ohio were also decimated by these expulsions. Between 1813 and 1871, U.S. forces carried out hundreds of massacres across North America, often targeting the most vulnerable women, children, and the elderly. Historians widely regard these campaigns as one of the largest series of mass killings in human history. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, between 1850 and 1890, approximately 19,000 European settlers and 45,000 Native Americans were killed in frontier conflicts. However, many scholars believe the true indigenous death toll during this period was far higher. Before European contact, the population of the Americas may have been around 15 million, but over the centuries following colonization, tens of millions of indigenous lives were lost. The indigenous population of the Americas declined drastically in the first centuries of European contact. From the late 15th to the 19th century, European colonization brought catastrophic consequences for native peoples. Historians estimate that over the course of about 4 centuries, nearly 25 million indigenous people were killed throughout the Americas. Of these, more than 13 million perished in territories controlled by Spain, over 10 million in Brazil, and more than 1 million in massacres carried out by Europeans and later the U.S. government. These numbers do not include countless unrecorded deaths from individual killings, torture, forced labor, and imprisonment. In much of Latin America, indigenous men were almost entirely eliminated, leaving most of today's descendants the product of unions between European men and indigenous women. By the early 20th century, although some indigenous communities survived in parts of Latin America, the vast majority of the continent's native population had been destroyed. Today, countries with significant indigenous populations include Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, the United States, Chile, Colombia, Canada. Many of these communities continue to preserve their cultural traditions, including religion, social organization, and autonomy. While some indigenous peoples have assimilated into modern culture, others still live relatively isolated from mainstream society, and a few remain largely uncontacted. In the United States, Native Americans now make up only about 1% of the population, many of them living in regions with harsh natural conditions, such as the arid highlands of the West. In Brazil, nearly 20 indigenous tribes have already been eradicated by modern encroachment, and around 2,000 people from other tribes in the Amazon rainforest are at risk of extinction.